Hi, welcome to a new episode in the Internet Surfer, hosting the most horror and creepiest stories from Reddit. Please don't forget to comment, like, share, and subscribe. Enjoy.
Where the Bad Cops Go. A long horror story from Reddit Nosleep. I write this as a reminder to put all that I've seen and heard into words. For far too long, I've looked back on these past few years as something impossible, something that happened to someone else. But that's far from the truth, even if the truth and I have always had a tentative relationship at the best of times. Consider this a confession. A peek behind the curtain of something I never would have believed. Let's start from the top. My mother was a police officer in a busy metropolitan area. I never wanted to be a police officer like her, but it seemed inevitable. No matter what I tried to study, I would always fall back on that familiar role, the law keeper, arbiter and diplomat. The one who settles disputes and held people to their word. For a while I thought I might get into politics, but I get too flustered in debates. I can't stand a dishonest argument, so politician or lawyer were not an option. So, when I say that I never wanted to be a police officer, that's God's truth. But I had to be. It was the only thing that made sense. My mother died of cervical cancer in my last year at the academy, so when I finally got to walk my own beat, I couldn't help but to feel that I'd replaced her. My handler was very understanding of what I was going through, so when it was time to hit the streets, she cut me a lot of slack. A little too much, it turns out. See, there was this one part of the city that my handler told me to actively avoid. Whenever we got a call originating from this one area, my handler actively ignored it, unless it was something akin to an ongoing shootout. It got to the point where we would respond to calls, only to never show up. It was shady as hell, but practice is often very different from theory. I thought it was some kind of unwritten rule. Turns out, it was a lot worse than I'd imagined. My handler and a couple of other officers were economically involved with what can best be described as a smorgasbord of illicit dealings. Ignoring calls allowed both traffickers and dealers to run rampant, and we got a cut of the deal. Well, they did. The union swept a lot of it under the rug. 3 officers quit their jobs and went into private security, but I didn't want that. I still felt like I had my mom's boots on, I was in her place. So, when it was my time to plead my case, I did what I could to make a fair and reasonable argument. But as I've said, I'm not good in debates. I remember the chief looking up from his papers as an advisor whispered in his ear. He gave me a concerned look. Obviously, we can't keep you here, he explained. But if you're up for it, we got something in mind. But you got to be up for it. I agreed. Hell, or high water, I'd do my job. This is how I ended up as a newcomer in the Tomskog Police Department. Tomskog is an odd little rural Minnesota town in the middle of nowhere. If you don't know where to take an uncomfortable left off the highway, you'll miss it. There are no signs, and most people who move there never leave. It's like a social black hole, the equivalent of unsubscribing from all internet platforms and walking into the woods. According to the chief, a lot of officers with questionable backgrounds were given a chance to work at Tomskog PD. Not because they desperately needed people, but because it was a good way to gain some brownie points with the local government and keeping the union happy. In fact, people with questionable ethics were encouraged at the Tomskog PD. I thought it might have to do with a lack of action. I mean, a bad police officer can't really do any harm if there's nothing to do. I got to the station on a foggy November morning after a hasty over-the-weekend move. There was space for 2 squad cars on the lot out front, but both were out on patrol. A shoddy white plastic sign with Tomskog PD hung outside, along with the town seal, a blue sunflower on a golden shield. I'd never seen those things before I got to Tomskog, but suddenly, they were everywhere. 6 people looked up from their desks as I entered. Most of them paid me no mind, but the sheriff painstakingly got up from his chair to greet me. A man in his early 50s with the build of a human meatball and the handlebar mustache of an ex-wrestler. He reminded me of a cartoon character, only with less of a smile. "Mason Brooks," he said, offering a meaty hand. "My condolences." "Excuse me?" "My condolences," he repeated. "I imagine you aren't too excited to be here." "Oh, yeah, no, it's fine," I said. "Happy to be of service." "You are shutting me," he laughed. "Well, aren't you the belle of the ball?" He gave me the tour of the place. The armory, the evidence lockup, the holding cells, and of course, my desk. If he hadn't pointed it out, I would have thought it was taken already. There was an unwashed coffee cup and a candy wrapper on it. "Don't mind that," Mason said. "People kind of come and go. Didn't figure this place would have that kind of turnover. You'd be surprised." He picked up a name sign from the edge of the desk. It was blank. I met my partner as he abused a vending machine. He was a balding man in his late 30s, wearing a kind of pinkish round sunglasses that made me think of John Lennon. I offered him a bill to try the machine again, but he waved me off. "If you hit it just right, you don't have to pay," he said, giving the machine another bashing. Mason just grinned, business as usual, it seemed. "This is Nick Aitken, your partner, and for the time being, handler," Mason explained. "Again, my condolences." "Oh no, didn't I just have a partner?" Nick asked. "Either I haven't had my morning Irish or someone's beaten my head straight, because I can't see two of you," Mason frowned. "Desk is empty, name's gone, time for a newbie." "Right." Nick shook my hand as a Coke rolled out. He seemed more eager about a free Coke than to have someone watching his back. Mason gave me an apologetic smile. "He'll show you the ropes," he said. "Man's an idiot, but you do well to listen. Idiots live long round here." "He isn't joking about that," Nick added, not looking up from his Coke. And with that, we were on our way. Nick fired up a cigarette long before we left the station, then took me round the back to a civilian vehicle. An egg-white Volvo with rust stains. "All squad cars taken, huh?" I asked. "Yeah, folks are cleaning up after Patrick." "Sorry, what?" "You'll see. Maybe." Tomskog has a single main road stretching through the entire town. There was a gas station, a high school, a couple of shops. A peculiar flower shop at the corner that seemed to only sell those trademark blue sunflowers. There was a sort of upward tilt on the west side of town that made the houses look stacked on top of one another. On the other side of town was a vast lake, eloquently named Frog Lake, where houses stretched out along the western ridge. It was a peaceful enough place, and in the right light, you could tell it was someone's home. But like with most little towns, you can't imagine what kind of people live there. It's like when you see a house in the middle of nowhere, who chooses to live there? What happened? I guess I hadn't yet come to the realization that I was about to become one of those people. Nick pulled up next to a corner pub. A place that looked old enough to have grandchildren. Before getting out of the car, Nick gave me a tired look. "We're just going to talk to a guy," he said. "He never comes into town unless there's something odd going on. We're going to have a chat." "Got it. Don't ask him any questions. Leave that to me. And don't touch him, he's a bit contagious." "In what way?" "Every way that matters," he sighed. "And what did I say about questions?" "You said not to ask him any." "You never said anything about asking you any." He tilted down his pink sunglasses, giving me a tired look. Shaking his head, he got out of the car. "I give you a week, rookie." Stepping into the pub, there was only two other people present. The owner, a sturdy man in his 70s who seemed transfixed on a thick-screen TV that played mostly static. The other was a man in his 40s with long dark hair. He had a couple of silver streaks running along his ears, a clean-shaven look, and a trucker cap. Much like Nick, the guy seemed comfortable wearing sunglasses indoors. "Digman," said Nick. "You drag your sorry ass back to town, huh?" "Meeting family," the man smiled. "It's a special day. You going to cause any trouble?" "Of course not." "Let me rephrase that," said Nick, throwing me a tired look. "What kind of trouble you are causing?" "Nothing," the man replied. "Just meeting family. Maybe going for a walk." Nick wasn't very happy with that answer, but there was little he could do. They said their goodbyes, and we stepped outside. The moment we got out, Nick fired up another cigarette and called it in. "Digman's up to some stuff," he spoke into the radio. "Keep a tail on him." Mason's voice came through. They didn't seem to bother with codes or formalities. "Nick, you're a snake. You're all tail. You stick to I'm." "Come on," Nick groaned. "The newbie can do it." "Do we need to have a discussion about the division of labor, Nick?" Nick took his hands off the radio and looked up at the sky with a sigh. "No, sir. That was our first assignment, spying on a civilian for no obvious reason. We saw how he met a shady-looking young man in his 20s, and the two of them spent a lot of time talking, eating nachos, and catching up. Meanwhile, I was trying to pass the time by getting to know Nick, and the town, a little better." "Tell me something," I said. "What makes being a cop here different from everywhere else?" Nick adjusted his sunglasses. "We don't sign reports," he said matter-of-factly. "What do you mean?" "I mean what I said, newcomer. We don't sign reports." "Of course you do. Everyone does." "Well, we don't." He looked back at Digman through the window, deeming him not to be an active threat. "I mean yeah, we got paperwork, but we don't really do it," he clarified. "Say you find a dead guy in an alley with his throat slit. What did you do?" That's a crime scene. You got to." Nick harked up an error sound, like the wrong answer at a game show. "You say it's an accident, you file it, and that's that. That's what you do." "Hell no." "Hell, yes you do. And you know why?" He turned to me, looking over his sunglasses. Something stern came over him. "Because if you don't, people die." He explained it as best as he could. The Tomskog PD never truly investigated anything on paper, because if they did, there'd be people coming by to ask questions. Questions like why people kept getting murdered, or why there were so many accidents out by Lake Adabat. And with questions, there'd be investigators, reporters, and government agents. "We can't have that," Nick continued. "They don't understand this town, and they'll get themselves killed. We're doing a necessary evil to keep the lid on. That doesn't make any sense. 35 people died here last year," Nick continued. "In a town of 7,500-something people, you know where that puts us? That's the highest murder rate in the country, by a mile. Hell, we make St. Louis look like a cotton candy petting zoo. Doesn't make sweeping it under the rug. More than half of those who died were outsiders. Relatives, good Samaritans, passers-by. If we can stop them from coming here, that means fewer dead folks stuffed in containers around the high school." He turned his attention back to the pub, leaning back in his seat. Without looking at me, he asked. "So, if we find a guy with a sliced throat in an alley, what do you say?" "I'm not saying it. Play ball here, newbie. I'm not asking. I'm telling." I swallowed my pride. The sheriff had asked me to listen to this man, and I wasn't about to mess up on my first day. I didn't like where this was going, and I wasn't buying that whole shtick, but I wasn't going to make any enemies. Not today. "Sounds like an accident," I said, rolling my eyes. "Awful stuff. A goddamn tragedy." Over the next few days, Nick and I tailed this Digman fellow, but there wasn't much to see. He kept to himself most of the time. Instead, we ended up going around town, responding to various requests and reports. Mostly domestic stuff, but a few odd cases popped up here and there. For example, every squad car had a BB gun for shooting frogs. We spent a good couple of hours on that. When asking about it, Nick just told me we did it to keep folks from catching the nastiest headache of their lives. He did not elaborate. There were other cases as well. We had to get a woman who'd eaten a bucket of dirt to a hospital. We had to take down fake stop signs that someone had put up by the road leading out of town. Once a week we had to go to the closed-down Tomskog Public Library and burn a copy of the Diary of Emmett Rask, who seemed to come back on its own. It was clear that this town was nothing like I'd imagined. This wasn't your average small-town kind of living, this was survival in a place where basic rules of life seemingly came and went. Much like the many newcomers of Tomskog PD. Over the weeks to come, I was having trouble adapting to life in Tomskog. We were filling out half-assed reports that sometimes outright lied, and no one seemed bothered by it. I started to feel a sort of resignation. My colleagues took notice, but there wasn't much they could do. Nick was sweet about it, he tried to show me around town and introduce me to the various folks who lived there. It was clear that he was making an effort, in his own casual way. I got myself a small house at the far end of town, just off the main road. The prices were ridiculous. I could afford a 2-story 5-room house as a single woman with a police officer's salary. Despite that, I settled for something a bit smaller. I figured the prices were just going to drop further, so any buy was a loss, but with the numbers we were talking about it didn't really matter. Still, getting settled in Tomskog was just odd. That's the best word for it. I barely considered myself a police officer anymore, I felt like a street sweeper. I wasn't serving or protecting, I was systematically ignoring problems for money. And not only that, but I was expected to do so. The turning point came on New Year's Eve. There were 4 of us staffing the phones, but most of us had mentally checked out hours ago. I was playing games on my work computer and the other 3 were having a dart contest in the break room. Nick was about 4 beers in. I almost missed the phone ringing. We had one line for rerouted calls from emergency services, and a direct line. I'd never seen the direct line ring before. I answered it. "Hi there," a woman on the other end said. "This is Miss Babin. I'm going to have to ask you to send a few officers." "What is this concerning, ma'am?" "I'm not entirely sure," she continued. "But I think something is affecting the residents." "Something?" I asked. "Like an animal?" "You better put Nick on the line, dear." I called Nick over. He had a short conversation with the person on the other end, then slapped his own face with an open hand. "Oh no!" He whistled, and the others perked up. He cleared his throat and put his hands on his hips. "We got a situation at the Babin building. We're heading out." There was no discussion. Whatever it was big enough to make Nick put on a serious face. I don't think I'd seen him really do that until that point. I drove. It was the first time we turned the sirens on. Nick was checking his handgun over and over. "This is Digman," he groaned. "I don't know how, or why, but it's got to be. Man's a menace. You two got history?" "Everyone's got history with Digman." "Bad history." I took a right, following the northernmost road to the outskirts of town, past the gas station. There was an apartment building with several cars parked outside. The moment I stopped the car, Nick was out the door. The others weren't far behind. I ran to catch up with him, and as he opened the front door, he called back to me. "Oh, and don't talk to Roy. He's a freak." The moment I stepped inside, I could taste some kind of chemical in the air. "Ammonia, maybe a bit of chlorine. Nick didn't seem too bothered by the smell, but I could tell he was worried. He turned to me as we got to the stairs. "You want to protect and serve, right?" "Yeah," I said, blinking at the question. "Of course. Then get to the top floor and start moving people. This place is contaminated." "With what?" "No idea. I'm going to check it out." While Nick went to speak with the landlord, me and the other 2 officers went up the stairs. The others stopped short of my floor, but I kept going. The smell was getting stronger, and I could feel it settling in the back of my throat. Some sort of chemical spill. This thing was going to stick to their furniture, no doubt about it. I knocked on the door of the top floor. Someone rushed to open it. I figured they'd been waiting to get the all clear to leave, so I relaxed a little. But as the door flung open, I didn't face a thankful citizen. It was a woman in her early 60s. Her pupils so widened that they looked black. I'd seen plenty of people on drugs before, but this was a whole other level. She stared at me with this huge grin, and as she did, I saw one of her teeth fall out of her open mouth. It clattered against her homemade welcome mat. Before I could introduce myself, she attacked me. She had this blue tint on her hands, like she'd accidentally washed them in some kind of ink. That's where the smell was coming from. It had the same powerful chemical stench to it that the rest of the building was bathing in. Those hands dove for my face, as if she wanted to pinch my cheeks. "Little wheat," she laughed. "You came to the harvest." She was surprisingly strong, but she had no technique. My heart skipped a beat as I got a meaty slap across the chest, and she tugged at my radio, but I managed to wrestle her to the ground. I put her in a hold that would make a grown man cry, but she laughed like a shrieking maniac. As I handcuffed her, I could see other doors around the floor open. There were 3 men in their 20s, still wearing party hats from their New Year's celebration. One with the blue stuff coming out of his ears, another from his mouth. The third looked like he was crying it. Another door with what looked like a married couple and a young girl. Yet another door with an older man, wandering out in nothing but his stained underwear. All of them with those blackened pupils and unearthly smiles. Some of them getting an occasional twitch, like their nerves were settling in cold water. "Little wheat," one chuckled. "She comes willingly. We are blessed. We are so blessed." And still, the old woman under my knee laughed herself hoarse. I was outnumbered. They sprang to action, rushing me, almost tripping over one another. I dove into the old woman's apartment, kicking the door closed with the heel of my boot. I hurried up to lock it, and as they piled up against the door I tripped backwards, knocking over a vase. The attackers were throwing themselves at the door with wild abandon. "Yes. Yes, she plays," someone laughed. Come see the harvest. Little wheat." I was cornered on the top floor. I touched my radio, but I couldn't get a message through. Everyone was talking all at once. I wasn't the only one panicking. This wasn't just happening on my floor. I had my taser and my firearm. I was trying to make sense of it in my head. Sure, it'd probably get swept under the carpet one way or another, but I'd never fired my gun at a living person before. Was my first time going to be firing openly at 7 civilians, one of which was a child? Was I even capable of that? But as the door buckled and the door frame creaked, I was going to have to make a tough decision. Would I fight to live another day or accept whatever may come? What kind of protect and serve would I represent? Another slam at the door. I needed time. I needed something, anything. So, I ran into the bathroom. I backed into it, locking it the moment the front door came down. The lights were off, and all I heard was this light drizzle, like someone had left the shower on. I turned the lights back on. My eyes stung. The smell was so pungent that it burned my nose, forcing me to sneeze. As my eyes adjusted, I realized I wasn't alone. There was an old man on the floor. It looked like he'd slipped and slammed his shoulder against the side of the toilet. He couldn't get up. He was almost entirely covered in that blue sludge, and I realized it was still running from the shower and the tap. He was looking at me, his eyes wide and black. His face half smiling at me, partially paralyzed. "Little, eat," he lisped. "Little, eat." Banging on the bathroom door. Laughter. Anywhere else, that'd just be what New Year's Eve was supposed to sound like, but to me, it was a promise. There was no doubt in my mind that these people would do something horrible to me if they got the chance. I had my hand on my service weapon, trying to figure out what to do. I've never been great with debates, not even in my own head. I kept going back and forth. I could do a warning shot first, then I'd go for kill shots as soon as that door budged. Or should I go for the leg? Should I do something about the old man? Was he a threat? Did I have enough bullets? I am armed and ready to defend myself. I called out. No response. Just more laughter and nonsensical gibberish. My hand was shaking, I was more scared than I'd realized. "I will fire," I yelled. "I am warning you, I will shoot to kill." Nothing. If anything, it just made them cheer even more. Louder. Eager. "Little wheat. Little wheat. Little wheat. Come to the harvest." The radio came through. "Nick. What's happening up there? They're breaking in the door." I yelled back. "I need backup." "Hide," he screamed back. "Can you get to the bathroom?" "I'm locked in. It's that chemical thing. It makes them crazy." I looked at the shower. It was still running, making a viscous goo that dripped at a steady pace. The door buckled. I saw the flash of a black-eyed grinning face as the hinges struggled. Another voice came through, the woman from the phone. She was using Nick's radio. "They use the smell," she said. "If you can smell like them, they won't attack." Looking at the running shower, I had an idea. It sounded insane, but this town didn't play by the rules. I was going to have to adapt. I put my service weapon away and pulled down the shower curtain, wrapping it around and over me like a cocoon. Then I stepped into the shower. I watched the blue goo run off me. Even through the plastic, it felt warm to the touch. Whatever this was, it was downright toxic, no doubt about it. As the door gave way with a crackling wooden bang, I pushed myself into a corner, hoping for the best as the shower kept running. They all slowed down to look at me. All those eyes turning my way. Even through the blue-tinted haze of the shower curtain, I could see their exaggerated grins. Their nonsensical words rotating into something new. Something calmer. Joined the harvest, yes. Yes, joined. The Reaper. The Reaper came. Thank you. Thank you, little wheat. I clutched the shower curtain close to me, begging that I wouldn't get any blue stuff on me. It ran right off but soaked into the soles of my shoes. I can't overstate how awful the smell was, and as we all stood there looking at one another, I was coming to terms with just how screwed I might be. They could reach me in less than a second if they wanted to. And even if they didn't, the fumes of this thing would be enough to send me sprawling to the floor in a matter of minutes. I wasn't getting any air, no matter how hard I breathed. It was like my lungs were coated with something sick. I was blinking to stay conscious. What had I been thinking? This was like trying to save yourself from drowning by wrapping your head in a plastic bag. It was just another way to suffocate. I couldn't feel my knees, but they were locked upright. But even with the tiniest sway, I'd fall like a Jenga tower. And that'd be it. I felt my fingers touch the tip of my service weapon. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe I could just kill them all and be done with it. But no, I couldn't. I was losing control. I couldn't move my thumb. I'll fire, I wheezed. I have a right to defend myself. I dipped in and out of consciousness, leaning against the wall. There was commotion in the other room. A couple of people left, a few stayed to look at me. I could hear the crackling of a taser. Breaking furniture. I didn't recognize the voices, but I could hear the trained cadence of other officers. I must have blacked out at some point. I tried taking a step forward and ended up collapsing on the floor. The shower curtain unfurled, all covered in blue, staining the floor like one of the town's trademark blue sunflowers. I ended up face to face with the old man. We shared a moment just looking at one another across the bathroom floor. Him grinning like a maniac, me just trying to stay conscious. "Why are you smiling?" I whispered. "Because it's all a joke, little wheat. And it's so funny." Seconds later, someone grabbed me by the shoulders. I was dragged out of the apartment, getting a quick look at what had happened. We'd gotten backup, 4 other officers, including Sheriff Mason himself. The attackers had been tossed, zip-tied, and handcuffed. They just pushed the kid into a wardrobe and barred the door. As my vision cleared, I watched Nick taking off my boots. "It hasn't soaked through," he sighed. "You'll be okay." "Sorry, I didn't help." "You are kidding," he scoffed. "No casualties. A couple broken bones and a few bruises, yes, but these people are going to be fine." He looked back into the apartment. They were still writhing around, moaning about harvests and wheat. Nick shrugged, looking back at me. "I mean, kind of fine." In the hours to come, the remaining people were evacuated. Most folks would recover after a couple of thorough scrubbings, others had to be hospitalized. I spent the next few hours sitting in our Volvo, trying to figure out if my legs were to be trusted yet. I could still taste the ammonia. I was going to need 100 showers. I caught a conversation between Nick and Mason. The sheriff was furious as to how they hadn't prepared for this. Nick recounted every call we'd checked out over the past few weeks, and nothing stood out. That is, until he got to John Digman. He said he had family in town, Nick explained. They were going to catch up. "Going for a walk," I smiled. "Doesn't sound too bad." Mason turned to me, slowly, then back to Nick. "Go for a walk?" Mason frowned. "He said that." John Digman said he was going for a walk. "Not specifically that he was, but, yeah," said Nick. "So what? And you're telling me this now?" Mason looked like he was about to beat Nick with his own shoe. Instead, he bit down on his handlebar mustache like an improvised binky. "He's doing it," Mason sighed. "That rust-brained possum stuff is going to do a goddamn year walk." "A what?" Mason pushed Nick up against the hood of the car, pointing at him with his entire hand. Mason was pissed. More pissed than I'd ever seen him. "A year walk. Get your mom's tits out your ears and perk up, you scab-faced. A year walk." Mason walked away, putting his phone to his ear. He looked back at Nick from the other side of the parking lot, still screaming at the top of his lungs. "Call the DUC. Tell them we need 2 of everything, 1:15 yesterday." Nick calmly walked to the driver's side of the car, opened the door, and sat down. He took off his pink-shaded sunglasses and buried his face in his arms, leaning against the steering wheel. For a moment we just sat there, breathing together. As if there was a chance this would all blow over any second, if we could just hold on a little longer. Nick leaned back, keeping his eyes closed. I felt like I had to say something. "I take it that calling the DUC is bad." "Yeah," he nodded. "It's bad." "How bad are we talking?" He looked at me with a kind of earnest sympathy that I'd never seen in him before. This was taking a toll. A real toll. This wasn't silly glasses Nick, this was I got bad news Nick. He opened his mouth, but all that came out was a stutter. Finally, he just threw up his arms in surrender. No idea. But it's as bad gets. This is the emergency glass you break after all other glass has already broke. The alarms that other alarms pull to get out of trouble. It's the worst. I'm counting on overtime then. It was a comment to lighten the mood, but Nick just shook his head. Without a word, he got out, leaving his pink sunglasses behind. He walked off, screaming expletives as he dialed the longest number I'd ever seen. All the while, the New Year's Eve celebrations were going strong. Rockets and lantern lighting up the sky to distant cheers. Warmth was returning to my hands and feet. I was starting to understand. When they said the town of Tomskog was unlike anything else, this was what they were talking about. It wasn't just some hick town in the middle of nowhere, it was a place where the rules are different. And where rules are different, laws had to be different. This wasn't just the place where the bad police officers go, we were a necessary evil. And in the months to come, that was going to be a hard lesson to learn.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.